There's something about grief that nobody adequately warns you about. Not the sadness. Most people expect some version of that. Not the waves of it, the unpredictability, the moments that arrive without warning in the middle of completely ordinary things. Those are hard, but they're named. They've been described. What's harder to describe, and what many people only recognize when they're deep inside it, is the specific experience of reaching for who you were before the loss and finding that person isn't quite there anymore. Not gone entirely, but changed in ways that feel less like growth and more like subtraction. A version of yourself that knew how to be in the world in a particular way no longer has access to the same ground it stood on. This isn't depression, exactly, though it can coexist with it. It isn't simply missing the person or the thing that was lost. It's the disorientation of realizing that part of your identity was assembled in relation to what's now gone. And when that relationship disappears, so does a specific part of how you understood yourself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why grief does this specifically, why it doesn't just take a you lost, but takes part of who you were in relation to them, and what that understanding changes about what recovery actually looks like. Stay until the end, because the final section addresses something most grief support completely ignores. What you do with the parts of yourself that were constructed in relation to something that no longer exists. Let's start with how identity actually works, because this is where most explanations of grief stop short. Your sense of self isn't a fixed internal entity you carry around intact, separate from your circumstances and relationships. It's a narrative, an ongoing story you construct and continuously update about who you are, what matters to you, what role you occupy, and how you fit into the world around you. And that narrative is always relational. It's built partly in response to and in connection with specific people, roles, places, and versions of your life that exist alongside you over time. You're not just yourself in isolation. You are yourself as someone's partner, or someone's parent, or someone's closest friend. You are yourself in the context of a particular career, a particular place, a particular daily life that has texture and shape and meaning. You are yourself in relation to the future you are building with someone or something, the version of your life that was taking shape in a particular direction that made sense in relation to what now no longer exists. When a significant loss occurs, the loss doesn't only remove the person, the role, or the situation. It removes the relational context within which a specific part of your identity was operating. Psychologists who study grief and identity describe this as identity disruption, the breakdown of established self-understandings and role identities that result from the loss of significant relationships or life structures. Who you were as their partner, their parent, their closest confidant, that version of you had daily expression, daily practice, daily confirmation. It existed in the doing of countless small things that were organized around the relationship or situation that is now gone. And when those things stop, that version of you loses the context in which it was real. This explains something that many grieving people describe but struggle to articulate: the sense of not quite knowing who they are anymore, not in a dramatic existential way, but in a quiet, practical, daily way. The loss of knowing how to structure a morning, or what to do with an evening, or how to think about the future, when the organizing principles that gave those things their shape have been removed. It's not only longing for what was lost. It's the loss of a version of yourself that only existed in relation to what is now absent. Here's where it becomes more specific. Research on grief and identity, particularly work by psychologist Robert Neimeyer, who has studied what he calls meaning-making in bereavement, has found that the degree of identity disruption following a loss is closely predicted by how central the lost relationship or role was to the grieving person's self-concept. Losses that were peripheral to identity, painful, but not structurally central to how the person understood themselves, produce grief that is intense but relatively self-contained. Losses that were woven into the core of how the person understood who they were produce a qualitatively different experience. Not just grief for what's gone, but a kind of foundational disorientation about who is doing the grieving. This is why the loss of a long-term partner often produces this experience more intensely than the loss of an acquaintance. even if the acquaintance was well-liked. And it's why the loss of a role, the end of a career, the death of a parent when you've spent years as someone's child, the end of a version of your life you had been building toward, can produce grief that surprises people with its intensity, because from the outside it may look like something other than loss in the conventional sense. And here's the part that reframes what recovery actually means. Most conventional models of grief describe recovery as a process of moving through stages, accepting the loss, and returning to functioning. This is partially useful, but misses something important. Returning to who you were before the loss is often not possible, because part of who you were was constituted by what is now gone. The relational ground on which that version of you stood no longer exists. What actually happens in healthy grief, when it moves in a direction that allows someone to rebuild a functional life, is not a return to who they were before. It's a reconstruction of identity that gradually incorporates the loss rather than simply resolving it. The lost relationship, role, or version of life doesn't stop being part of who you are. It becomes a different kind of part, something carried rather than something lived in, something that shaped you rather than something you are currently in relation to. The grief shifts slowly and unevenly from an active disruption of identity to an integrated dimension of it. This distinction matters practically because it changes what you look for as evidence that grief is moving. If you're looking for the return of who you were before, for the grief to end, for things to feel the way they felt before the loss, you're setting a benchmark that identity disruption makes structurally inaccessible. What actually becomes possible is something different. The gradual emergence of a self that has absorbed the loss and built around it, that carries the absence without being defined entirely by it, that can function and even find meaning without requiring the restoration of what can't be restored. So what does this mean practically for how you relate to your own grief or to someone else's? First, allow the identity disruption to be named as what it is. The confusion about who you are after a significant loss is not a symptom of something going wrong with the grief. It's a direct reflection of how central the lost relationship or role was to your self-concept. Naming it accurately as identity disruption rather than simple sadness often reduces the secondary distress of wondering what's wrong with you for feeling it. Second, resist the pressure to return to who you were before. The before version was partly constituted by what is now gone. A more useful orientation is toward something it needs to eventually leave behind. Third, pay deliberate attention to which parts of yourself survive the loss intact and which parts require reconstruction. This isn't a pleasant inventory, but it's a useful one. The parts that remain, values, ways of engaging with the world, capacities and interests that exist independently of the lost relationship or role, are the foundation of the reconstruction. The parts that depended on the lost context for their daily expression may need to find new contexts in which to become real again, or may gradually transform into something adjacent rather than identical. Here's what ties this together. Grief takes more than who or what was lost. It takes the version of you that existed in relation to that person, role, or life. The daily practices, the organizing structures, the relational ground on which a specific part of your identity stood and was confirmed. What recovery builds isn't a return. It's something different, something that carries the loss rather than resolving it, that incorporates what's gone into who continues. And understanding that this is the actual shape of the process, not a return to before, but a gradual construction of after, is one of the most genuinely useful things you can know when you're in the middle of it. If this explains something you've experienced, tell us in the comments. What part of yourself did you lose alongside the person or life situation you were grieving? And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own emotional experience, the next video is right there.